Hi all, it's Jessica. Today we're doing parallel and perpendicular lines for D2. Let's get started and go ahead and follow along with your note sheet. Getting started with parallel lines, we need to remember that they have the same slope and that whenever we're solving, we are always using the form y equals mx plus b to identify our slope. That is slope-intercept form, where m is your slope and b is the y-intercept. Looking at example 1, it says find the slope of a line parallel to y equals 3/4 x plus 2. So if we remember that y equals mx plus b, where m is our slope, then we're dealing with this equation in terms of our 3/4 x plus 2. And so let's think about, what does m equal? Well, where is our slope? It's in front of x, it's m, and so what do we have then in front of our x? It is going to be that 3/4. Okay. So whenever I answer what the slope is, notice that I'm just going to write 3/4. Next up, let's look at perpendicular lines. Perpendicular lines have slopes that are opposite, fill that in, reciprocals of each other. That is, their slopes have the product of -1. Okay, so what does opposite mean? If we're taking the opposite of an expression, we're changing the sign, multiplying by -1. And for a reciprocal, that is in shorthand just flipping our fraction. If it's a fraction, if we had a slope of 2, that's like 2/1. Okay, so we can change it to that so that we can take the reciprocal more easily and flip it. So let's look at example 2, part A. It says find the slope of a line perpendicular to y equals 3/4 x minus 3. Okay, so whenever we look at this one, we need to first look at the slope and identify what that is, right? Because perpendicular, we're going to have to manipulate that a little bit. So in this case, when we look at our slope, the slope of our given line is 3/4. Okay, you'll see that written there. And then if we're taking a line perpendicular, we need the opposite and the reciprocal. So notice we had a positive 3/4. It's now becoming negative in what we're working with at this time. And then also we're taking the reciprocal, or flipping our fraction. So 3/4 becomes a 4/3. Okay, so the opposite reciprocal of 3/4 is that -4/3. And we defined these perpendicular lines, opposite reciprocals. That means when we multiply them together, we're going to get -1. So you can always check that to make sure that you have that correct. When you find your slope of a perpendicular line, you can check it by multiplying them together. And yes, it does look like we do get -1. Okay, so at this time, I want you guys to go ahead and try part B on your own. Looking at part B, you should have arrived at your perpendicular slope to that given line, -2x plus 5, would be 1/2. Okay, 1/2 is the opposite reciprocal of -2. Okay, example 3, we are finding the slope of a line parallel to the given line and also the slope of a line perpendicular to the given line. A double whammy, we're finding both of them here. Notice that whenever I am looking at this one, we have that it is -3x plus 5. Okay, so we need to remember back to that very first slide where we looked at, we first need to have it in slope-intercept form. What that means is that it's y equals mx plus b, so it is solved for y. Okay, so if I look at -3x plus 5y equals -11, okay, and I'm trying to solve it for y, I first want to get my 5y by itself, so I need to get rid of this -3x. And so the opposite of a -3x is going to be a positive 3x. Okay, and when I do that, I need to add it to both sides. Okay, now I want you to think about this. What is -11 plus 3x? Am I going to add those numbers together? What am I going to do? Okay, that's a common mistake that can be made if we don't think about it correctly. So over here on the left side, my 3's cancel out. That's what we wanted, so that we're left with 5y, and we're a little bit closer to having it solved for y. But on the right side of the equal sign, I can't combine those because they're not like terms, okay? So don't be tempted to combine those numbers together. We need to leave that as 3x, and I'm writing that first. That way it's already nice and in slope-intercept form, and then just keeping the sign of my constant a negative 11, okay? So we can't combine them because they're not like terms. One is a constant, one has that variable x. So now we're looking at 5y, and remember that anytime we have a number right next to a variable, that means that it is multiplication, right? When things are written next to each other, we're multiplying. So the opposite would be to divide by 5, and we need to do that to everything, okay? Dividing everything by 5. So over here on the left, 5 divided by 5, that divides out to be 1. So we just have a 1 single y, which is what we wanted. And now we have 3/5 x, right? 3x over 5 is the same thing as 3/5 x. Once again, writing it to our slope-intercept form, and minus 11/5. Okay, so we had two things we were asking. First, we wanted to find out the parallel. Okay, so parallel, let's remind ourselves, those lines have the same slope. Okay, so if we're dealing with the same slope, that means it's going to be just that. It's going to be m is equal to 3/5, okay, the same as our given line. If we're dealing with perpendicular, and I'm just going to abbreviate here, okay, if we're dealing with the opposite reciprocal, okay, and so what is that? The opposite of a positive 3/5 is going to be negative for our m, and then reciprocal, that means flip, okay, so 3/5, if we flip-flop that, we're going to be left with 5/3, okay, very good.